I want to take you through today what I've been starting to think about as taking a PhD in education and trying to boil it down to 45 minutes. So that's our single serving of the kinds of things and the kinds of lenses and the kinds of questions that might help your actual assessments in a real situation. So if it's philosophical and it doesn't get to something useful, it's not worth anything to us, but what can we pull out to use for our classes? This comes from some work that's been done on creativity. Creative personalities are often people who have great depth of understanding, and everybody who's in this webinar does. Your field expertise, your disciplinary knowledge, that's your depth. And then it can also be really helpful to have that breadth across the top of the T. And so what I'm hoping today is a little piece of that breadth from outside of your field, and what can you grab from the field of education and make your own and make useful. I will briefly introduce myself. Actually, Gabriella covered everything. I teach some courses. I teach some grad students how to teach. I've come at this from both the science and the education side. So I kind of walk both feet in that canyon all the time. I've done some research, and I have some baby pictures for you. I'm so happy to have come to meet the SI group, especially because I got into this through a happy hour, and just everyone I've met has not only had the expertise of, incredible disciplines, but are coming to this because they really want to. So this is the best audience I will ever find. And I will probably learn more than you just by doing this. All right, for the chat, I would like you to please tell me, if you have a second, if you have a keyboard, what academic disciplines are in our room today. You might get to see my face. I don't get to see your face, but I can at least see some fields slide down there. Great, and while you're putting that in, oh, this is wonderful. We've got some scientists and some far from natural scientists. Love it. Oh, excellent. And a few people who have specialties in science education who are going to be people that I probably speak to more easily. Wonderful. So I want to take you through one philosophical lens in the literature on assessments. So by the time that you've decided to give an assessment, and then you're going to report a grade after it, those are things that you can do independently. But what we're going to focus on is this big black box in the middle. Everything else that tells us how do we do this part well. But this isn't just another part of your teaching. This is a hard part of your teaching. This is a creative part of your teaching. This is a highly technical, highly visible, often very misunderstood part of what you do. In many professors' words, most of the conflict they have with students comes somewhere around their assessment. And so this isn't just another part of the job. This is a hugely problematic part of the job. So we're going to open up a poll for you just to get some sense of how you think about this. So I think, Gabriella, you're opening poll number 1 now. Beautiful. Just take a few seconds and tell me, coming into this, how do we do assessment well? Awesome. This gives me what I need. So I think I can end it there. Thanks, everyone. Mistakes are a big part of this process. And that's our majority answer is learn by making these mistakes. And hopefully, if we do our professional development job well, maybe we can talk through some of the mistakes before we hit them ourselves. The old school way of making all of the mistakes personally is how too many of us learn. So this is the triangle of assessment that Pellegrino et al. Wrote in 2001 in their national document on assessments. And it has 3 parts that I want to talk to you about. And these are parts of assessment that really bring up and emerge questions for us. So one part of this triangle is cognition. Cognition is really saying, when I learn this material, how did I learn it? So if you are trying to think about how did you learn to read a scientific paper, there were particular actions you did, particular assessments you took, particular practices that you took up. And for us thinking about cognition, especially in a group that is mostly professors and lecturers and faculty, we need to think more importantly, how do others learn this? because the 108 people on this call are not average students. In fact, very, very far from it. So we want to think about, if it's a scientific paper, you perhaps took your first scientific paper and excitedly dove in and read it from start to finish, and your big old brain started to put things in order. And that may not be how students come to that assessment. And so thinking through those differences is one of the important first questions for assessments. Going quickly through some more philosophy. Another corner of the triangle is observation. So what did you choose to assess? You have your options, and no matter what field you're in, you can choose different parts of that. So what did you choose and why did you choose it? You might have assigned a 3-page paper to your students. If you're a history professor, that may be looking for instances where they're putting together cause and effect, or seeing long trends, or understanding the scope of time and place. The same 3-page paper for somebody in marketing may be much more about using emotional language and connecting with the audience and trying to figure out their wants and needs, even within the exact same assessment model. And these values, or these choices, reflect values back to your students. So that observation really tells you something not about what students are going to tell you, but about what they're going to hear from the process. Lastly, on the philosophy side, interpretation. So did you see what you were hoping for? In evolution in particular, we often, as evolutionary biologists, we like to look for very particular kinds of argumentation that use passive voice and use particular terms and not other terms. But sometimes when you don't see that, sometimes it's a content issue. The student may not understand evolution, but it might be that they understand it in a different way. It might be that they see it more mathematically than more verbally. And these kind of problems of interpretation are things that we have to watch out for in assessments. Now, this was a bunch of philosophy jammed into 2 minutes. And what I want to do is I want to talk about a very specific part of interpretation that's going to affect every one of us. And that is, one place that's repeatedly problematic is the language of assessments. So language impacts interpretation in every assessment that you can put on paper or say to a student. And that's because all knowledge is fundamentally rooted in a language. It's not devoid of a language. It's not sitting on the wall of Plato's cave somewhere. It is in that cultural experience. English language learners especially, and not that English language is special in any way, but most of us are probably teaching primarily in English. English language learners are the only minoritized demographic that is explicitly temporary. They are English language learners for a while, and then they will move beyond that. And that's different than any other demographic group that we traditionally see as having less opportunity through academia and past it. All assessments are biased towards experienced speakers in the language. You cannot get away from the fact that there's a bias there, but you may be able to minimize that degree of bias through how you use your grammar. And if you're wondering if I'm going to do a 4-minute deep dive into grammar, or if you're hoping for it, you're in luck. I'm going to present some of the grammar rules brought out by Abedi and Linquante, who are some of the absolute best linguists working in assessment. And I'm going to do it in an overview style, but I'm going to leave you the rules, and these might be helpful for you on your own assessments. The political scientists might recognize this kind of prompt for a written question. And we're going to go from this prompt to a revised prompt where we've reduced the linguistic complexity. These have just about the same number of words. They say really, really close to the exact same thing. But I've made 6 different changes to make them easier to read to somebody who doesn't read English at an expert language. If you want to search for them, just stop listening for a few minutes and then you won't get any spoilers. But here's what I've done. To reduce the linguistic complexity, I followed Abedi and Linquante's rules. And the first thing is that we've taken out words that make for good and artistic writing, and we've replaced them with boringly accurate terms. We've also taken out words like tendencies, which have a cultural component, and replaced them with things that are more likely to be recognizable across cultures, words like laws. There's a question in the chat of Abedi and Linquenti they both work at Stanford, I believe, and they work primarily in the K-12 system, thinking about how English language affects who gets through testing barriers. And all of my links are live, so you could actually just grab that. If you would rather read that PDF than listen to me, they're the experts. The third one is you can replace modal verb phrases with simple present tense. This can drastically reduce the load on people who come from different verb systems and structures. And subordinate clauses can also be simplified. So I think that's in red for you. Great. Another place where you can use present tense more often is to replace a modal that has passive voice, and then the present tense can make it much more clear. And then lastly, and I actually think this is the key, especially for science writing, is for our assessments, removing recursive statements. You know, recursive statements are statements within statements within statements. And the way to see if you have one is almost always the word of. If you have the word of in your sentence, you may need to look through that and see if there's a way that you can flatten that out. Now, I do not present these as if you're going to understand each of the pieces of grammar perfectly on my first 1-minute run through, but you might be able to take this list back to your assessments and see, oh, am I a person that writes with lots of modal verbs? If you are, you may be able to make this easier for some of your students who are currently English language learners. Pausing there after the shotgun of grammar. We're going to put up a quick poll to see if any of these 6 ring true to you. Do any of these 6 methods seem like they might work explicitly well for your particular assessments? I would love to see what you think. Don't feel like you have to vote, but I'll just give you 20 seconds or so to tell me which of these 6 methods might help your students most.
And while everybody's taking this poll, I would like to just remind people that you can ask questions and write those text questions in the chat. If they are relevant to the current discussion, then we can go ahead and ask Ben to answer them here. And if you'd like to wait till the end, we always have a 15-minute question and answer session at the very end.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabriella. And I'm so glad I have Glenn here to help me parse through the questions, because literally every question I've gotten from the SI group, I'm like, oh, cool, let's go talk about that for an hour because they're really interesting. Thanks for everybody who's voted in. Replacing terms seems like a big thing for us in that it's often not the scientific terms that trip our students up, especially our students who are English language learners. It's the other terms that we think of as common English language that might be a lot easier to pull out. And Gabriella, is it easy for you to put the results of the poll in the chat? Or is it easier for me to just talk through them?
Not everybody has voted, but I guess I could close the poll now if you'd like me to. And then I could put the results of the poll in the chat. I think it'd be good if you just talked over it for 1 minute. I think this is great so far. I feel like you're giving all these no-brainer strategies that people don't always think about, but very, very useful. All right, sharing the results right now.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Also, Miriam, wonderful comment. We will definitely get there. So replacing terms, both interesting but uncommon terms, and replacing terms that are unnecessarily specific, those are coming up for about half of all the people here. Others that are coming up, so replacing modal verb phrases, that's less common. Subordinate clauses is less common. Modals with passive voice is less common. Part of which might be because you might not think of those terms very often, and that's totally okay. Abedi and Linquante have great examples. You might just see the kind of phrasing you use all the time in one of their lists, and you don't have to be an expert in grammar to take one of your particular kinds of grammar complexities and start to habitually iron that out. And then it looks like about 40% of people are saying recursive statements might be really useful for their students, which I totally agree with. Okay.
And we have an interesting question that's on topic here from Lindsay. In the sciences, how do we walk the line between accurate scientific terminology and jargon that might be causing extra complexity?
Yeah, excellent. Specific jargon within your class is not extra linguistic complexity. So if you have to use endoplasmic reticulum 4 times in a paragraph, that's not big words, just because they might add to the average grade level of the reading by having lots of syllables. That's not adding complexity, because your students should know that. But you could say endoplasmic reticulum, and the next word is forwarding. And forwarding is a word that might mean something to me, but it might mean something else to a student who's thinking about email. It might mean something else to a student who's thinking mostly about sports. And we might be talking about like pushing those proteins through the different vesicles. That kind of word you might replace with something that's more concrete, like moving. That's part of Lindsay's question. The other part of it is that we clearly want students doing more complicated English work later in their college career. And I think the key there is framing. For new students to college, students who are particularly vulnerable, non-major students who are coming into the practice of sciences, those are students we need to support more. And later, when we're talking about using, like, you might pull a paragraph from an actual scientific paper and use that in your assessment. And that's a place to address, and, you know, with one of those micro statements in class, like, you know, this is using common language. Scientists aren't perfect, so some of the English is hard to get through. And that can really frame it for students as, oh, right, there is no single perfect way to use a language. Language is a tool that we can use, and that can help them get past that point. Mm-hmm. That is an excellent question, and I gave it a 1-minute answer. I love this group. Okay, I'm going to go forward from grammar. I'm going to say, congratulations. You've mastered grammar. You have the perfect assessment document. It's clear, it's valid, and it has diminished bias. So why don't you feel good about it? What you're probably looking for is educative assessment. So this is the radical notion that assignments help students learn. And there's a book titled Educative Assessment. It was written in '98 by Grant Wiggins, sadly no relation to me. And that book, I'm guessing that everybody in SI will be nodding over and over again reading this book. If educative assessment, if the idea of using assignments to help people learn, if that doesn't make immediate sense, one way to think about it is to imagine the opposite. Construct an assessment that will not help learning in any way. How would you do that? One way you can think about doing that is arrive to a class having no relationship with those students, force them to take a pop quiz on something that's not related to their course goals, and then don't give them the answer. They're going to give you information, but they're not going to learn anything from that process. And what we're trying to do is be as far away from that as possible. I am guessing that this is true for everybody on this webinar, that we need to assign scores. But the larger goal is really helping our students succeed. So we have to have these two things going on at once. And I have some suggestions stolen from Grant Wiggins' book and presented to you here so I can take credit for them. Here are 3 ways to make your assessment more educative. So one is to put metacognition into the assessment. And many of us try to treat metacognition in our classes and think about the ways that our students are thinking or having them do that thought. Within your assessment, one thing you can do is you can highlight how learned skills apply to real life. So if you have, if you're in music and you have a prompt for a student who's going to come in and give a recital, somewhere in that prompt you can say, look, this recital isn't just for this class. It's also great practice for a stressful job interview or pitching a product. Now, those are kind of farther away from the music field, but you're talking about skills that students are learning and you're putting it directly on the assessment, so it's part of that process. Following along with that, all of our students are performing in ways that are not possible before the class. And you can highlight those things on the assessment or in your discussion of the assessment. So a statement like, you couldn't have done this at the start of the semester, but now you can do this thing. A lot of our students won't realize that unless we really make it explicit. And your exam or your assessment is where your mouth and your money meet. And for students, any words on there, that must really have come from your heart. Second method for making your assessment more educative, and somebody has already beaten me this in the chat, is to allow more time or opportunities to learn from the assignment or the assessment. One of those is to break things into smaller pieces. So if you have 3 large papers, you could break that into 5 smaller papers. This will do less blocking and cramming of information and will allow for practices like interleaving that do more for students' ability to do dynamic retrieval. If you have not read Bjork and Bjork, they write some really great experiment-based and short papers. Those are some fun ones. They might give you some ideas for assessments. Another thing you can do to help to allow more time or opportunities is to increase the interval in which students are working, especially for English language pressures or any language pressures. If you can stretch out the time, you can allow more learning in the same process. Now, you can't just have students come in and take a 5-hour exam when they used to take a 1-hour exam. Probably you don't have the facilities to do that, nor are you paid extra for that. But you might be able to stretch some of that work. Instead of giving them as much to do at a surprise kind of exam, you might be able to tell them more of what they're going to do, give them some options to study into, and then stretch out a few days where they're coming in to perform in your same 1 hour. Again, I'm just trying to get more learning bang for the same buck. Lastly, the alignment of your assessment environment will really help for better learning. You don't have to change the assessment necessarily to increase the amount of learning students can do from your assignments. You have probably heard about backward design at this point many times, and it is worth mentioning every single time you talk about classes, because backward design is really the basis of how you're going to match up what they should learn with what they're actually doing. And I just want to add to that you can also change the assessment in ways that don't change the assessment at all. This is a quote down in the green box that I have heard from many lecturers, which is that in some way the assessment is constrained. Either they're team teaching, so here at the UW Chemistry Department, there will be 4 to 6 sections of 500 students each taught by a different professor, but they have to take a common exam. So each individual professor has no choice in what's in that exam. So any changes they're going to make are going to have to be indirect. How do you change the assessment without changing the assessment? Here are some ideas, and I'm just putting them into a graphical form so you don't have to read my text for as long. Here's your course, or a blocky visual diagram of it. So this might be 1 day of your class session, and here's the assessment that we're talking about. There are some things that you can do really close to the assessment that can really help. You can build pre-exam practice into parts of your class. Now, the traditional college course says, in class I talk, and at home you study. And building in windows where people can explicitly study for that assessment is treating them more like the mental athletes or mental performers that they really are. Similarly, close to the assessment, you might give second chance types of assignments. So you can take one poor score you got on one of your questions and say, resubmit that, turn it in for a partial score later. And I've seen that done well in a lot of places.
Ben, can I interject for just a moment? We have a question that I think maybe we should actually wait on and talk at the end. But Mary is asking if we can comment on how the move to virtual instruction is going to affect all of this. I'm wondering if we want to talk about that at the end.
Yeah, how about this? Glenn, how about I go through this slide and I'm going to show a bunch of options, and then let's go back and let's do them all from an online perspective and see if they'd work.
I love it. Let's do it.
Cool. Thanks, Mary. So you can take problems from one assessment. Let's say you give exams, and on exam 2, one problem a lot of students in your class struggled. You can take that exact same problem, you don't have to write a new one, and stick it on the following assessment. And you might say, yeah, but they know the problem's going to be there. Aren't they all going to be perfect on it? To which I say, you got them, right? They will be able to show you that they have learned that. And the actual grade that's coming from your exam is not based on total score. It's based in variability of score. So even if you gave them a 10-point question out of 100 on the second assessment, you still will probably get the variability in the other 90 points that you need. I know giving actual scores is definitely one of those two goals we have to hold. Another one of these things that can happen really close to the assessment is that you can give your preliminary answer key more quickly. And many of us want our answer keys implicitly, especially people who are doing math-based work. You want everything to be right. And so that might mean let's give the assessment, see how it goes, write out the key, and then we're a day or two into the process. There may have been some of your students who would have productively used some answers for their own learning immediately after. If you can drop that preliminary answer key, and it doesn't have to be the final version, but if you can drop that on them right after the assessment, you're going to have some percentage of your students who go to that and complete a learning cycle of I studied, I performed, I got feedback right then. It won't work for everybody, but for those students, that's learning that they wouldn't have done otherwise. Okay, lastly, it's never lastly with me. There are some conversations that you can have around the assessment that are part of it. And for many courses, these conversations are happening in the assessment or in writing up at the top saying like, here's what we're going to do about cheating. Here's how the assessment format works. Here's how grading is going to work. By taking these small conversations and putting them early in the quarter, you can spread out the assessment, let students do some of that metacognition earlier where it's high value instead of in the assessment where, especially with time pressures, it can't be high value. And some of these discussions can hit home a lot more. They can see what you're doing and what your reasons for are, and they can also see the relevance to their real life. That is something to hit students with before the actual assessment is on their desk.
We have another quick question that you might actually be about to say. So, but it's asking about two-stage exams and whether that is similar to releasing the answer key, or would you consider it a different technique?
Yeah, I've seen some great two-stage exams that are like a second chance assignment. So do the exam and then resubmit part of it. I've seen some two-stage exams that the first stage is more like personal practice and then the second stage is the real assessment. I actually don't care which of my particular terms you fit that in, but two-stage assessment can be wonderful for students. And you know, if you think about the people who are going to become concert pianists or athletes or, you know, a lot of the, you know, welders, you're talking about people who are not taking a two-stage exam for how they're doing their work. They're really taking a 50-stage exam. And that the closer we get to that model, the more we're apprenticing students and not just putting them into seats.
Yep.
So I love two-stage exams. It may not, those exact words might not fit in here. Thanks, Glenn.
Mm-hmm.
Callbacks to skills shown. So this is getting a little bit to metacognition, but for the same assessment, if you can talk and if you get to a later class and you say, well, we talked about protein structure and now we're talking about enzyme regulation and you've already mastered protein structure and this is why you can walk into this room today and learn. Those are explicit pieces that you know about your class, but you've got to say them to really get the learning. If you want study groups, you should incentivize it. You can give points, you can make time in your class, but if you want those things to happen, if you want it, students need to see it not just in your words, but also in your points. And so building that into the assessment. So you might say, we're going to take 15 minutes at the end of this class, you know, class number 4, but on the assessment, I'm going to ask you, who were your group members? You know, who did you match up with? Who did you study with? And that's putting it right into the style of the assessment. Last thing, and we're going to talk about online. Second to last thing, many of us know the competing classes that students are also studying for. So if you know that in weeks 3, 6, and 9, your molecular biology course is going to be running up against organic chemistry, avoid that if you can. And let students spread out their work so they can have a protein structure week instead of this is an exam week where I'm just running around trying to keep all the pieces together. In fact, a lot of these things that I've said, if you had to take a downgrade in some of the other pieces of your assessment, but you just spread it out with some of the other high impact learning that students are doing, you might actually increase the total benefit to students. And lastly, you can catalyze the practice that you allow students to do by pre-releasing parts of the assessment. I've mentioned this a little bit before, but when you give students either the exact thing that they're going to perform on, or a way to figure out or guess at what they're going to perform on, or you give them some of it, like you give them the structure of the assessment but not the data, or the data but not the question, or the question but not the context. You're letting students practice into your mind. They're really feeling how you're going to assess them, and you spread out practice. For some of their courses, the only time they actually get to practice is in the assessment. And in your class, if you do this, this can be 3 or 4 days of really rich material going. So Glenn, you said Mary was asking about which of these can be done online. So I'm going to go through them really quickly and just see. Okay, look at this. We got animations. You can do it. Okay, you're doing this online. Can you schedule time for pre-exam practice? A couple of sessions before the exam, can you pull students into breakout rooms and give them a practice question and have them explicitly do it there? I think you can do that one. Can you give them a second chance assignment? Take something that you missed in the first one and resubmit it later, even if it's just for a couple of participation points. Yep, good, we're good for online. Can you put problem items on a following assessment? Yes. Glenn challenged me on any of these that I'm too glib about. Can you release a preliminary answer key? Absolutely. And your students are just online. It's not like they need to physically move themselves to go find it in the window of a basement in the chemistry building somewhere. They can access that as soon as they're done. Can you put these discussions in online? Well, your online time with your students is precious. There isn't that much attention. There isn't that much bandwidth for every discussion that you want to have. One way I've seen this really effectively done is that an instructor will have a 50-minute class and say, hey, we're going to do content here, but then at the end when they're recapping, they'll say, I have some thoughts about why I assess in the ways that I do. They're not really necessary for you to understand ecology, but if you're interested in them, I'm going to keep talking about them, and you can check out that recording later. We started doing that during some big snowstorms about 5 years ago. And what we found is that a huge number of our students were continuing with the videos because they wanted to hear those personal comments. And it's about the assessment, which really affects their bottom line. So that might be a place to put some of that. Although it's going to be harder than it would be in person for sure. It's also harder to show physically that you really mean it. You're going to have to push out some of that emotion while you're online. Calling back to skills shown, I think you can definitely do that. Incentivizing study group formation. This one's going to be harder. When you can get people in person next to each other, it's the path of least resistance to just hand out each other's contact information. You can build spreadsheets, you can connect people together. It can get complicated, and often those are harder to get students to do. I would say that if you're in an online situation, you're incentivizing with a study group is you might want to keep something like breakout rooms to be really consistent for 3 or 4 days in a row, and then say, you have done 3 days of work with these people. If it's working for you, now is the time to go back to your breakout room, trade your contact information, and consider using that outside of class. Scheduling to avoid other assessments. I think all scheduling things are probably more difficult online, so that's going to be harder, but maybe still possible, and results are going to vary by institution. And can you pre-release parts of your assessment? Absolutely. And if you do nothing else in this entire 45 minutes besides hear that this person, Ben, really thinks that I should give students some of their challenge early, that is the single best thing I think that you can do to make your assessments part of the learning process.
So we have a couple more questions that, again, maybe you're going to dive into, but folks who are concerned about running the exam itself, like when you have a large course and a summative assessment, and you have to do it online, what are the actual mechanics of doing that?
Yeah. Is it okay, Glenn, can we push those to the question and answer session? Because usually I'm going to have to ask for some information there.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I
awesome.
think that's great.
I'm gonna roll here because what I really want to talk about is deliberate practice. We're starting to think about, in this 45 minutes, about higher education assessments as part of a larger ecosystem of task-based learning. It's not just a class with assessments stapled onto it. And this really meshes well with the 5-part framework that makes up deliberate practice. So this is written back around the turn of the century by Anders Ericsson. And there are 5 pieces that, when you have these 5 pieces, humans learn best. If you are on the chat and you can think of a great example for one of these, please throw it in the chat as we go. Let's make sure that I can see the chat. So the 5 pieces that have been identified as really helping for lots of different kinds of learning, and absolutely in classes. The first is that students need to be aimed towards well-defined goals. This will surprise nobody in the community that understands backward design, but you've got to have those defined goals. Secondly, students or learners of any kind need to be provided with timely feedback. The timelier, the betterer. And so if it's 3 weeks before they get a score back, they're going to learn less than if it's 3 minutes before they can access some kind of answer. Now, both 1 and 2 are great, but unless you have the opportunity to really put some time on task and to practice repeatedly, they won't be enough. And there is no substitute for this is where 10,000 hours comes from. There's no substitute for students being able to really drill over and over. And so we've got students with well-defined goals. They're getting feedback on drills or practice they can do often. All of those things will help them to learn one skill. And so to really learn well, students need to be gradually progressed through the practice of increasing difficulty. So not just the same memorize this kind of molecule or do these kind of flashcards, but now that you've figured out the molecule, now tell me this about it. Now understand this piece of it, and gradually pushing them up and up. If you have those 4 pieces, you still might not get good learning. Because what I just laid out is that a student will understand really well-defined goals, which are hard to read, and then they'll get constant criticism, and they'll be practicing over and over again while being criticized. And because the difficulty is always going up, they're always failing. If you do these first 4 right, it should be brutal. And so the number 5 is that students need to be emotionally motivated to persevere. If you have any 4 of these, as per deliberate practice, if you've got 4 out of the 5, learning is still possible to happen. Humans are really good at it, but it's going to plateau. And what you really want is to get all 5 of these, and that's where you see your greatest growth. Sure, Ben, that sounds like a theory, but what are some ways to put these 5 pieces into practice? Here are the suggestions that I will take credit for. Whether or not I deserve any credit, they all have backing in the literature, but they're things that I've seen well used in college and university classrooms. So on the left are those 5 pieces, and across the top, I'm going to talk about large-scale changes. If you see a large-scale change that you like, please do not try it this year. Start that process of thinking towards one of these big scale changes, and take those on slowly and carefully. Medium scale changes, you might try one this quarter. It's going to take a few weeks to build up to it, and you want to work on your framing, you want to work on the text, but you might take one of those. And then the low hanging fruit is probably most where we're going to be focusing for things that you're doing this quarter, for things that pop out to you as like, oh, that would be really easy to do in my class. So here are those suggestions. This is a lot of text, so I'm going to be quiet for 30 seconds and let you read through some of these. I know that we're going to take some of the questions to the question time, but in about 30 seconds, I'm going to have a poll for you. Glenn, is it okay if I take Lindsay's question now?
Yeah, sure. We've got a minute. Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. Lindsay asked, can I explain score-dependent emails? Here's how I have used it after stealing this method from other people. So I give an exam to 800 students. And then I take about 80, I line everybody up by exam score, and I write the top 80 students an email saying how proud I am of them. And the next 80 students, how well they are doing in the class and how much they're learning. And the next 80 students that I really think they're going well and they have room to improve and I'm excited to see what they do. And I'll write 4 or 5 of these emails that go to big groups each. And we also, as a class, we have teaching assistants, that's our privilege, and we have teaching assistants reach out to people individually who are struggling. But those score-dependent emails to people who are doing really well have turned out to be really motivating. Often it's easy to write off the people with the 4.0s and say, well, that's fine. But I'm finding that people who score really well on one exam and get those things, I'm getting them into my major. I'm getting them into my research labs. I'm seeing them take up the entire field and changing because they're really getting motivated in that. So A, don't ignore your best students. And B, those individual emails, writing 2 or 3 emails, even though you really want to include something like, hey, this is a score-based assessment. I know the score doesn't define you, but still, great score. Those kind of things can be fantastically motivating for students, especially if their other 4 or 5 professors at the same time are not contacting them. You might be the one who's really reaching out. I see that about 75 people have answered in. Awesome. And just to read you some of the things that I'm seeing almost half of us saying that attending to students' emotional motivation might help them make more sustainable learning, and that more timely feedback is the other top answer. If there are ways to give students slightly more things to do and maybe less value, that can increase the number of times they go through kind of a learning loop. Again, these are hopefully finding some low-hanging fruit. Something that you look at this chart and you say, oh, that's easy for my particular class. If that is easy for you, take it up. And if you see one of these, even if it's in my low-hanging fruit and it's hard for your situation, avoid, 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 because they all help. And you're just looking for 1 or 2 things. Okay, I'm gonna move forward, although this chart is gonna stay in the notes and you can access it whenever you want. Last thing I'm gonna talk about, and I'm gonna go through this very quickly. Grade-based assessments are almost always very individual. So the question is, from the education field, do the experts who think about purely education, do they think that collaborative learning works better? And the answer is, yeah, they basically all do. Here's a huge list down at the bottom of people who base their lives on the idea that collaborative learning works better than just doing things on your own. So how do you build that into assessments? Here's 4 ways to do that. One is, if you're trying to increase content learning, the use of jigsaw style teaching. So students taking up one piece, teaching each other, and then everybody being assessed on all of the parts can be a really good way to learn a lot of content in a relatively short amount of time. And you get side benefits for equity as well. If you have never heard Ellie Theobald speak, she is the next presenter in this series next month, I believe, and she is fantastic. Absolutely, you should star that on your calendar. If what you're trying to do is develop field-specific collaboration skills, one suggestion is to do that project-based work in groups and giving team grades. Now, there are ways in the literature to do team grades well so that students aren't just angry at each other. And if it works for your situation, it also decreases the total number of grading that you do. If what you're trying to do in your assessment is point out key differences between how your course in your field works and how careers in your field works, you can keep the individual projects, but then let students self-organized for when they're presenting their work. So if they are each doing a project in some other research area or they're reporting on some of their paper, give students a chance to say, look, we're going to take 10 minutes and find your group with whom you will decide your presentation, like you're putting together a symposium for a conference. They can keep their individual grades, but it helps learn about how their careers are going to start to mesh. And last one I'm going to mention here, if you're trying to build community within a course and you want to use your assessments to do that, you might incentivize that collaboration by the way that you do your whole class grading calculation. This is my personal favorite. I do it in a class where we're really talking about community-based survival. And so students' grades are in part community-based survival. No student in the class can get above a 3.4 unless a certain percentage of students finish their final project. And the only way anyone in the class can get a 4.0 is if every single person in the class finishes their final project. Usually students at the beginning of this process, I'll get a bunch of really top graded students looking at me sideways and I'm not sure if this class is for me. And in 6 years of doing this, I have never had a class not unlock the entire 4.0 grading scale. And I hope it brings home the message through the assessment. Now, I am definitely running out of time here. So what I'd like to leave you with is a bunch of readings. If you would like to do any of them, all those links should be live. And just to thank you, because I've tried to bring you 45 minutes of education theory, which is fun to try to boil a PhD down into less than an hour, but you're the people who are going to make that into reality. And all of that theory floats out in the atmosphere until you put it into assessment, or you put it into a style, or you put it into your comments, and you make it work for real students. So thank you for that work that you continue to do. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ben. You were getting some compliments in the chat. I do have a couple of questions that I bookmarked for Q&A time here, if you're ready. Mm-hmm. The first is from Chris, who asks about alternative assessments in large classrooms.
Okay.
They're thinking about doing some kind of portfolio type assessment, mm-hmm. but is it feasible in a large classroom? How do you operationalize that?
Yeah, so a portfolio in my mind is usually putting together 2 or 3 different kinds of assignment to say, this is the work that I've done throughout. So if you came to me and you said, I have a X 100-person class, something big, anything over 100 is really big. And in that, I'm going to try to do a portfolio where students do some writing, and they do some presenting, and they do some video, and they put it in, and I grade the whole thing. I'm going to stop you right there, and I'm going to say, I don't think you have enough hours in the day to grade the whole thing. That kind of pure portfolio, like you might see in an art class, I think is too much. For a really large class, though, one thing you can do is build it's kind of a quasi-portfolio out of the things that students are already doing. So you can ask students, and I'm going to use my large intro molecular biology class as my example. That's the most pressing thing for me. One thing I could try, if I wanted to go down the portfolio route, is I could say, your assignment to come in with your final exam, or maybe in lieu of the final exam, is that I want you to pull one exam question that you did, that you think you answered really well, and I want you to deepen that answer by another, say, 50% of text. And I want you to pull one experiment that you did in one of our labs, and I want you to present the decisions that you made in 2 paragraphs. And I want you to take 1 day of class, and I want you to summarize it in 3 sentences and give me the next 3 questions that you would want to ask as you go into an upper division course. Now, that is not a pure portfolio. That's not a huge amount of work for one student that wouldn't be somewhere otherwise. But it's a chance for students to gather some of their work together, and then for you to assess that. If you were going to follow to the letter of everything that I've said, I would suggest allowing some peer grading first, and then use either yourself or your teaching team to grade with those peer grades as a guide. We find in our hands that most peer grading is harsher than professor grading. And so it might be actually less time intensive to go through a portfolio and say, take the peer grade, does that seem to match? Sure. But then there's a professor check on it. Mm. That is my 30-second answer to a really interesting question. Chris, if you want to talk more about that, if you think I'm going in a direction that would be interesting to you, please email me afterwards.
On that same topic, I can't actually see the name. Oh, it's Peggy. Was suggesting for the portfolio, you could ask students to do a metacognitive essay where they pull from their work to explain to you. So similar to what you were saying about the sampling, but they get to choose how they sample.
Love it. I really like Peggy's idea. I have nothing more that I could possibly add to make that better. But I would suggest, if I was your professor coach, I would suggest, if you are going to do that, pull something else out. Because if it works for your class and you know it's a good idea, take something else out of your life. Don't just try to add things, and it's probably going to make it more sustainable.
So the second question that I put a pin in is regarding those emails, the score dependent email. There were some folks that were curious about like what kinds of things you say, and we're wondering if you have examples that you could share. Yes,
I absolutely have examples. How about this? Gabrielle and Glenn, can I, as soon as we're done here, can I pull a set of 4 examples, stick them in a slide, and have that go out with the slides that we post?
Yeah, sure. That's no problem at all.
Awesome. Will do.
Great.
If you've watched me wave my hands up here excitedly and be really pumped up about the work you're doing, you can probably imagine that I basically write that same way to students. I'll definitely send those out.
So those are the questions that I noticed and put on my list. We still have more than 100 folks in the audience, though. Does anybody have any other questions? We've got about 5 more minutes. Also, a lot of compliments. People really enjoyed this webinar.
That's super nice to say. Thank you. Come back for Ellie Theobald. You will not be sorry.
And today you've added so much to our growing library of free resources available to faculty who find their way to our website. So a note to our audience, you can check our website at www.summerinstitutes.org under the header entitled Resources. Then you can go to Webinar Series, scroll down for past webinars, and you'll find within a day or two a recording of this webinar. Also, if you want to see shorter presentations of past presenter offerings given during our weekly happy hours, including the one by Ben, or if you want to take your further questions and comments about assessments to an asynchronous cyber location, I want to encourage you to sign up to our SI discussion board. That's a Slack workspace. I'll put the link in the chat box in a moment. And then finally, as you're still thinking of questions, feel free to ask more questions. But if you like this webinar and you'd like to see more presenters speak at length on topics significant to today's teaching environment, please do take this post survey. I'm going to go ahead and put those all in the chat and let us know of a topic that really interests you, one that you'd like us to find a presenter for. Again, Ben, I'm so glad you came. You really gave us lots of great, substantial, easy to implement strategies that we can use when creating assessments from now on.
Awesome. Gabriella, did you also say that the assessment pillar in the Slack is going to be a good place? I may have missed that. But.
No, you're right. I should have said that. So it would be great if you took your questions and comments to the Slack discussion board entitled, again, SI discussion board, but probably the channel that's best suited to this conversation would be the number three assessments. It's called Third Pillar of Scientific Teaching Assessments. You're right, Ben. Thanks for reminding me about that.
I will definitely be on there. If people have questions there, if I can't sleep, that's where I'll be.
And I think we're gonna need that, because when I ask for questions, we've got a lot of questions here. So folks, if we don't get to your questions, which looks like we're not going to, drop them into the Slack channel, start a conversation. We'll be active there. Then I saw one that caught my eye that's been on my mind. Miriam is wondering about overloading students with too many assessments, either with assessment fatigue or she mentioned too many assessments for them to keep track of everything.
Unsurprisingly, Miriam has a great question. Miriam, the way I've come to think about this is that I'm not as worried about the number of assessments as I am about the type of assessments. So I've seen classes that have, say, 14 total assignments in an entire semester, but they're 5 different kinds of things. So they have 3 of this and 2 of this and 1 of these other ones and 5 exams. And students are always trying to figure out what's going on. I've seen other classes that have 120 assignments. And for 30 days of class, they have, or sorry, for 60 days of class, they have 1 pre-class thing and 1 post-class thing. And I think it's the rhythm much more than it is the total number of assessments that really matters to students. So my suggestion is, my guess is that most of the time, most assessment strategies we do either because that's what's always been done or because that's what works for our class. And if you're trying to decrease the fatigue, it's if you have quizzes and responses and surveys, is there something in the survey that you can just make part of a quiz so that it's only a thing? From doing lots of focus groups with students, you'll ask them about their overall workload and they'll say, well, I have class A, B, and C. In class A, I do quizzes and an exam. In class B, every week I have a report. And in class C, oh man, I have a couple of surveys and a couple of exams, and then I have to write a paper and we have to do a debate. And that's really stressful, is the types, but the total number is less so because it's that consistent timing. So my suggestion is, yeah, if fatigue is the issue, decrease the types and that might be more manageable than you might not have control of. Can you just decrease a bunch of assessment?
Yeah, that's good. And you'll notice, folks who have been to several of our webinars, we always drop that survey into the chat 5 minutes before the end of the session for that same reason of rhythm. We're up against the hour, but I do have one more scorching question that's on everyone's mind. So people need to go, but I'm going to ask this one last question. How do you talk to your students about cheating and encourage them not to use the sites that are out there that record exam information, but do it in a positive way that isn't obnoxious?
Yeah. This is fantastic. I think I might have seen Liz Steve's name on this list. And Liz, if you can help me, the contract cheating panel or webinar, if we can get that linked, I think that would be helpful for a lot of people. There's this group, I think they're in British Columbia, that just does a beautiful talk about this. My take on, awesome, thank you. My take on this is a couple of things. One is that I think I can connect with my students best when they feel that I am honest with them. And I don't just mean not outright lies, but I'm getting some emotion here. Radically honest with students in that I am open and transparent about whatever comes up for them. And I think that is a thing that is an onus for teachers. And your second grade teacher knew it, and your middle school teacher knew it, and you're a college teacher, and you're gonna know it. That when students hear the truth over and over from you, especially in 2020, when there's a lot of places that are bending that around them, when they get that from you, then you come back later and you say 4 weeks later, like, look, I really think the best thing for you is to try your best on this exam and let the scores play out how they may and do your work and let that guide your learning. You've already established this pattern that what you say means something to them. And without that pattern, the exact same words might not work in a different course or might not work for the same students. So radical honesty throughout to set up that moment where you say, do your own work, I think is huge. And that's hard because I don't have a p-value for that. I don't have an experiment for that. I don't have a very discrete, this is exactly the proof. This is a soft skill and it works with your style or it doesn't. Another way, and this is because I'm kind of an assessment nerd, is I think that if your assessments force them to do high-level work, you will earn their effort. And when we have assessments, and I am as guilty of this, and probably in terms of number of students, much more guilty than many of people in my entire history, but when you give low-level exams and low-level questions and low-level tasks, that busy work proves to them that cheating is a reasonable strategy, because it's not really a reflection of their whole self. And my guess is that people who misuse course supports like Chegg and Course Hero, and I work with Course Hero, full disclosure, so I've definitely been critical of them in the past as well, but people who misuse that for cheating often think of it as like, well, it's low-level work anyway, why not? But in the courses I see where people are doing really career-intensive or career-relevant skill building, they generally don't think of those options as frequently or as presently, unless they get to a desperate level. That is a very incomplete answer to a very interesting question. So I think I'm going to leave it there for time reasons, but my two big things are earn their trust and use your assessments to earn their respect. And I think that you will generally see better results on the cheating side.
I think that's great. And I think that's a wonderful point to end on. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Gabriella, do you have any more announcements?
Actually, I don't, except for one more encouragement that you please do fill out the post survey. That helps us so much to figure out what it is that you're needing and wanting us to find presenters for. So please do that. I'm going to put that in the chat, and then basically we can put off our cameras and say goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.